resource, be it a published app or published desktop, consists of 4 high-level phases. We have user authentication, we have resource enumeration, we have resource launch, and session initialization. Let's begin with the authentication phase. The user will open up a web browser or the CWA, which is pointed to Storefront. And Storefront will supply the user a logon page. The user enters their username and password and clicks the logon button. Storefront contacts the AD domain controller to make sure the credentials that the user passed were authentic. And once AD authenticates that user, it sends a response back to Storefront saying, okay, we have our user here. Essentially, our first phase is done. The user is authenticated. We're ready to move on to the next phase, which is resource enumeration. So Storefront has the credentials for the user. Storefront passes the credentials over to the DDC. And the DDC needs to retrieve the list of Active Directory security groups that this user belongs to. So DDC will go ahead and contact AD for that information, and AD will go ahead and send it back to the DDC. So now we have the credentials and we have the security groups, and now we need to know, okay, so what resources in our site does this user have authorization to access? In that case, that information is stored in the SQL server, so the DDC is going to have to reach out to the SQL server and retrieve the list of resources available for that user. Okay. So the DDC has this list now, and DDC will take that list along with the icons that it pulled from SQL for those resources, and we'll send it back to Storefront. And once Storefront has it, it needs to render it into HTML format because the user's looking at either a web page or a web page version of that information on the CWA. So at this point now, the user is able to see the list of resources that user is able to launch, and enumeration is complete. All right, to keep things clean, I wiped the lines off the board. So far, we've already authenticated our user, and we performed resource enumeration. So the user is now looking at a screen that has the icon representation of all of the resources that they are able to launch. So we're going to head into the third phase, which is the resource launch phase. Right? So the user goes ahead and clicks an app, and this signifies to Storefront that it's time for a launch request to start. So Storefront takes that request and forwards it to the delivery controller. And now the DDC knows what the resource wants to launch, but it doesn't yet know which VDA has the best, it doesn't yet know which VDA is best suited to service this request. So it does a little bit of a calculation, and it thinks about things like load balancing and the availability of the application, and it chooses one of these VDAs to host the session. So once it selects the VDA, it tells that VDA, it says, hey, can you get a session ready for my user who's going to be connecting in a few moments? All right, so now the DDC has chosen a VDA. That means it knows all the information that it needs to tell the user how to connect to the VDA. So the DDC sends that information back to Storefront. And Storefront's job right now is to create the file that the CWA is going to use to launch that VDA resource. We call this file a .ica file, or you can call it an ICA file. And this file is a text file that is going to get sent back to the user's endpoint. And once it's there, the CWA is going to automatically open it, and it's going to see, okay, this is the VDA name, and these are some information about how to get connected to that VDA, and it will go ahead and automatically connect the user to the VDA. So now we have a connection from the user's endpoint to the VDA. So at this point, we've launched the resource effectively. It's ready to go here. We've made a connection. And remember this, let's say this is a Windows VDA. The user has yet to log in. So what we're going to do at this point is initialize a session over here, and the user will be able to connect to it. So When that VDA got the prepare for session request, it was sitting there waiting for the user to connect. Once this connection is made, we enter the session initialization phase, and in this phase, we run through the entire Windows logon process. So at this point, the Citrix Workspace app uses the ICA file to automatically connect to the VDA. The VDA initializes a session for that user, and the user connects to that session. At this point, the VDA begins the logon process for that user, where we apply group policies and we load the user profile. Once complete, that app session is being displayed now on the user's endpoint, and the DDC knows that it's okay, I'm gonna go ahead and check out a license to allow that user to continue working. So now the user is able to fully interact with that application or desktop, and our launch process is complete. We've went through the user authentication phase, we've completed the resource enumeration phase, we've completed resource launch, and now we've finally completed the session initialization phase.